How flexible are original antique rapiers and small swords? Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, a viewer of mine, a guy called Ken J. So Kenneth J, word out to you, thank you for sending the email, which I read this morning. I thought, do you know what, that's a great topic for a small video. So I'm going to try and keep this fairly concise. It's going to be an old school Matt Easton Schola Gladiatoria style video of me in front of a wall of swords, exactly how I started out my channel all those years ago. So a simple question is, how stiff or flexible are various different types of rapier and smallsword? Now, before I grab some actual swords off the wall and show you how they flex, how much they flex and where they flex, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the general context behind blade flexibility. So in theory, you can make a sword or knife blade that doesn't, in realistic terms, flex at all. If I just grab a completely different type of weapon here, this is an Indian katar. This has an incredibly thick blade and an incredibly short blade. And clearly a human of typical human strength, I'm not the Hulk, I am not able to flex that at all. So at the most extreme example, a blade which is relatively thick compared to its length will be a rigid bar, like a kind of girder. And certain swords are much closer to that because of their thickness relative to their length, and also that leads to mass, or weight if you prefer. So if you make the blade really thick and really short and really heavy, it's likely to be very, very stiff. But clearly, rapiers and small swords want to be long, narrow and light. If you make a rapier or small sword heavier, yes, you will in some cases make it stiffer. So if you make the cross section thicker and the blade wider, it will become stiffer, but it will also become heavier. So all of this, the basic answer to this question, how stiff is a rapier or small sword? The basic answer, before we go into the actual examples and look at some originals, the basic answer is however stiff you want it to be, but bear in mind there is always a trade-off. If you add width, if you reduce length, if you increase thickness, yes, you can make it stiffer, but you reduce reach, you make it heavier, you make it more cumbersome, you make it in many ways a less effective weapon for dueling in the street against someone wearing clothes. Now, if you were using a cavalry weapon like an S-stock, essentially a short lance, that you might want something that doesn't matter if it's a bit heavier, doesn't even matter if it's maybe a bit shorter, but you want it to be super, super stiff, then yes, indeed, you accept you make it heavier in order to make it thicker. Okay, so different types of blades make different compromises for their end goal. But rapiers and small swords, for the most part, have a similar end goal of fighting another human, usually not wearing armor and usually on foot. Now, the next very important piece of context before we start pulling things off the wall is to bear in mind that different rapiers and different small swords prioritize cut versus thrust versus reach versus weight in different ways. So some weapons might want to be lighter, some weapons might specialize only in thrusting, some weapons might specialize in being very long, and some might want the ability to cut. And this obviously changes the cross section, and it's really the cross section and the mass of that cross section, in other words, the volume of the area of the cross section, that dictates how flexible the blade is and also where it flexes. So first up, we are going to look at a rapier of about 1630, and this one here is an English rapier. There we go. And this is a cut and thrust blade. So this is an English rapier of, let's say, 1620 to 1640, so with the middle of date of about 1630. And this is a typically English style hilt, but the blade is probably imported from Germany. And you'll notice that this has a blade which at the cutting portion is a flattened diamond section, or close to lozenge. It doesn't have a particularly defined midrib. So you'll notice that the blade does have some width to it, and it certainly has sharp edges. So whilst this wouldn't hack limbs off anyone, this would be able to give a fairly decent cut to a face, a neck, a forearm, a hand, a thigh, something like this. So enough potentially to put someone out of a fight, or at least injure them even through clothing. So this would cut through clothing into a thigh or a forearm, for example, enough to maybe disable a person or at least disadvantage them in the fight, but it is a primarily thrusting weapon. Now, because it's a requirement to cut, it actually has a blade which is really quite flexible. but it is obviously much thicker up here. So regular viewers will understand what distal taper is. Distal taper, as it's commonly referred to in application to the modern sword world, means that the blade starts very thick here and gets progressively thinner down to the tip. In some cases it's non-linear, so if it was a straight line graph down from the base to the tip, that would be called linear distal taper. Many blades, particularly sabres, have non-linear distal taper. That is, they'll gradually get thinner and then they'll suddenly step down and then suddenly get thinner down here. In other words, they'll have a flatter section here and then a thicker section here, because this is the defensive half of the blade that you want to be stiff, and this is the thinner part of the blade that you want to thrust or cut through targets and pass through them easily, and also be lighter so that in the hand it's easier to move because you have less mass at the tip. Anyway, these are original antiques in my collection, so clearly I'm not going to abusively flex them, but I can, using a modicum of force, flex them fairly easily, and you can see that this blade is really quite flexible, and that is because it has to have a fairly flat blade up here in order to have the edge geometry to have an effective cutting blade. So because this is a compromise cut and thrust blade, this actually has a fairly thin blade that is fairly flexible up here but completely stiff down here. So this blade only really flexes in the second half of the blade from the middle to the tip, and is very flexible in that second half. So the next rapier we're going to look at is on the surface a very different type of rapier. It's Spanish, and it is a so-called shell hilt. Okay, you can see there, of a type with a Spanish lion on it. This is actually a type of rapier from about 1650 to 1670. Again, original antique, probably a replacement grip wrap on it, although maybe not, difficult to tell. But it's a good, solid, nice example. And this, again, has a compromise cut and thrust blade. But this blade is slightly thicker in the foible. The foible is the end half of the blade, or end third of the blade. It is slightly thicker and slightly narrower. So I would say, compared to the English rapier we just looked at, and obviously it's got a completely different type of hilt, but we're not looking at hilts here. Compared to the previous English type we looked at, this has actually got a very similar blade. And it is not impossible that the blade on that English one is also Spanish. This is a Spanish blade on a Spanish hilt. Obviously Spanish blades at this time were very famous, a lot of them being made in Toledo. Now this blade is narrower than the English one, it's about the same length, but it is slightly, in fact quite a bit stiffer, because it is narrower this way and thicker this way. Okay, so because it is a narrower and thicker blade, the cross section is more rigid. And although it is still very flexible, well, relatively flexible, it is not as flexible as the previous one. So less cutting capacity in general, or should we say not such a fine edge geometry and a narrower blade, usually in most circumstances will lead to less cutting capacity. So this is more of a specialized thrusting blade, and therefore it is a stiffer blade. But you'll also notice that due to distal taper being about 7mm thick here and only being about 3mm thick here, in a more or less linear fashion, this is still balanced beautifully, very light at the tip, but it's very stiff in the first half of the blade. So completely, if we flex this gingerly, you can see it flexes in the second half of the blade and remains almost completely rigid in the first half of the blade. Obviously in literal scientific terms it does flex in the base of the blade, but in terms of what you feel and what you see and what you perceive, generally speaking, almost all of the flex that you notice is in the second half of the blade. So this is a stiffer blade, and that often accompanies more specialized thrusting blades with less cutting capacity. Now just for a second we are going to come off the track of rapiers and small swords and look very briefly at a Walloon broadsword. This is a different type of blade, but I want to show you for comparison that it flexes in a very similar way, but for slightly different reasons. So here we've got a 17th century, probably English, possibly Dutch. Oh, it's a bit stuck in there. There we go. Walloon broadsword. So this is obviously a blade which is a cut and thrust. Yes, of course you can still thrust with it. It's still a pointy piece of metal, but it is essentially a cutting sword. And in the period, in the late 17th century, this would have been viewed as something like a shearing sword, almost a proto-spadroon or broadsword. This is primarily a cutting sword which is also able to thrust, whereas rapiers are primarily thrusting swords which are, in some cases, also able to cut, but not always. Right, so this is a broadsword blade, obviously much broader, probably an imported German blade on an English, possibly Netherlands hilt. This blade flexes in exactly the same way and the same places as the rapiers, and with about the same ease. It's got similar distal taper. It's actually more like maybe about 5 or 6 millimeters here, and goes down thinner because it's not a dedicated thrusting sword, down to maybe 2 millimeters down here. But because it keeps the breadth, you've got to think about the amount of material in that cross section. So if we chop through here, if we chop through one of the rapiers, and you just measure the amount of metal in this portion of the blade, it's about the same but in a different form. So although this blade is thinner, it is broader. So it's got a similar amount of metal in it, and it flexes therefore with a similar amount of ease. And again, because of distal taper, it is stiff in the first half of the blade and flexible in the second half of the blade. Now, although those swords were diverse to some extent, they all had in common they were essentially a lozenge or flattened diamond section. What we're going to look at next is a specialized thrusting rapier that possibly might have been known as a tuck in its time. That is just a dedicated thruster. It has no cutting potential whatsoever because the blade cross-section is square. So instead of being edge geometry like that, the edges meet at 90 degrees. So you've seen this in recent videos. If you haven't, go and check out those videos. But this blade here is utterly, completely square. And in fact, it's completely square from about there upwards. So any portion of the blade that you're likely to be hitting someone with, the edge, you're only going to be hitting them essentially with a square bar. It might hurt them, it might have some effect, but it's not going to cut through clothes, it's not going to cut through flesh, unless you applied superhuman strength to it, which we can't do because we're not superhumans. So, no cutting potential whatsoever. But what about the flex? Because this is a very narrow blade. Well, actually, this is a bit stiffer. So despite the fact that we've made this blade very, very narrow in this plane and equally narrow in this plane, this is actually thicker than those sort of compromise cut and thrust rapier blades that we looked at a second ago. Because those blades have to be wider in this direction, they are thinner in this direction. That means that when we go to flex this, it has a deeper cross section, and although it has less mass, it has less mass and it has less material in that square, because it is a square, it is more rigid. So in other words, what we've done with this rapier, and many rapiers like it in fact, is we've sacrificed the ability to cut, to put everything into thrusting potential. And why is stiffness important to thrusting potential? Well, quite simply, points usually go through things fairly easily, but not always. And if you meet various layers of clothing or you hit a piece of cartilage or bone, you're going to meet resistance and you're not going to get deep penetration. So if you want deep penetration, you need a stiff weapon. Okay, important thing to remember there. So this weapon, yes, it sacrificed its cutting ability, and many people in the internet world will go, oh, it's rubbish because it can only thrust, it can't cut. But what it's gained is an extreme amount of nimbleness at the tip and an extreme amount of penetrative ability because of the stiffness of the blade. So it's an utterly specialized thrusting blade, somewhat similar to a Concierge or a S-Dark, but not as overbuilt and bulky as those, because those are cavalry weapons. This instead is built for dueling on foot, but has really specialized towards the thrust. And in that sense, it leads us very nicely onto the small swords. So very briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, what is a small sword? It's not a short sword per se, it's a scaled down, essentially, version of a rapier. So as rapiers developed, we get what's sometimes known as a transitional rapier. And those transitional rapiers, they got a little bit shorter, they got a bit lighter, the hilts got a bit smaller, and this leads into the small sword. So around 1670, 1680, we find that lots of gentlemen, instead of carrying rapiers around, took to carrying small swords around. They are lighter, they're easier to wear, they're not so long. Certain blade lengths have been come into royal edicts and laws and stuff like this. So in other words, they became more fashionable as a dueling weapon. And some people, and some of the treatises of the day, even argue that a small sword should be able to beat a rapier if used in the right way. in a duel. So they weren't regarded as inferior. They weren't necessarily just making them smaller and lighter and all this kind of stuff just for convenience. There were some people that believed this made it a more effective dueling weapon. And there are two things that you could say in combat terms are specialized about it. Number one, it's incredibly light and quick, okay? And number two, it is almost entirely, usually, dedicated to thrusting. Okay, now bearing in mind everything we've just seen with the rapiers, a specialised thrusting weapon therefore should be stiff and very light and quick at the tip, and that's what small swords tend to be. Now the first example I'm going to show you is actually slightly confuses the issue because it's what's probably a military small sword. That is, this is a type of small sword that someone thought, well, I'm going to war, I want something that's a little bit beefier with a few more options to it. And so this is actually a small sword that you can cut with. Now, some people might argue this isn't even a small sword and they might call it a shearing sword. So if we look at Donald McBain's treatise, for example, he might call this a shearing sword. Some people might refer to this as a spadroon even. And many of you know my views about spadroons on this channel, but it's become a bit of a meme, I know. But the fact is this is a small sword hilt on a primarily thrusting blade that has some cutting capacity. And because it has cutting capacity, it's a bit like that English rapier we saw all the way back at the beginning. It has a flattened diamond. In fact, it's actually flattened hexagonal section in this case, but it's very similar to a flattened diamond cross section. And therefore it's not especially thick, but it does have some extra width here that I would not want to, this has actually got a fairly fine edge on it. I would not want to hit my hand hard with that because it would really, really hurt. And if it was really sharpened up properly, it would cut tendons and that kind of stuff. So you can't shear, again, you can't shear necessarily through a lot of clothes, or you can't shear through limbs with this, but it can cut well enough that a cut to the thigh or the face or the neck or the hand will have some very noticeable effect. But the flexibility of this one is not that much because it is a fairly narrow blade. What they've done is they've not made it that thin here, okay? So they've kept a fair amount of cross-sectional thickness because you need that for the thrust to be effective. And if we made this as thin as a typical cutting sword, like that Walloon broadsword, this would be super flexible with that width and that thin thickness. But the problem is it would be too flexible in the thrust. And if you met, for example, a thick winter coat, like a greatcoat, and thrust into it, there's a chance that if it didn't pierce immediately, it would flex and all that energy would be lost. And that's what you have to remember. This is about energy transference. So if your blade is not going through the target, the blade is going to absorb that energy. And the more flexible the blade is, the more easily, or rather, yes, the more easily the point won't penetrate. So in other words, the less successful the point will be at getting through what it needs to get through. So you need a sharp tip and a stiff blade to ensure deep penetration. Okay, so this is a compromised blade. It has sacrificed some stiffness in the thrust, but it's still quite a stiff blade because it is still primarily a thrusting sword. And overall, for those reasons, it's pretty similar to the English and Spanish rapiers we saw at the beginning of this. But remember, this is a shorter blade, and that makes a big difference. And that's something that I think gets overlooked about the small sword. It's not only about the cross-section, and we're going to look at cross-sections in a second, but it's not only about the cross-section or the blade shape or the width, it's also about length. And the problem with rapiers is the longer the blade gets, the more flexible it gets. In other words, you're robbing yourself of penetrative power in the thrust. So it's always a trade-off. And remember that with rapier blade lengths, the longer they are, generally, the floppier they get as well. And even the mass of its own blade will start to exert a floppy effect when you're just maneuvering the sword around. So shorter blades remain stiffer and a bit more livelier, and because they are shorter, they flex less easily. Now, just briefly before I go on, I just want to mention heat treatment, because I know by this point some of you might be already writing in the comments about heat treatment, so I'm going to get in there before you. And yes, indeed, the type of steel and the type of heat treatment can also make a difference to the spring temper. You've seen that these are all spring temper blades going all the way back to about 1620 and all the way through. These are all springs. These are leaf springs, okay, exactly like you find on your Land Rover. And the type of steel used, the carbon content and the other alloys in the steel, but also how it's heat treated, can make a material difference on how flexible the blade is. Obviously, in the 17th and 18th centuries, these blades vary a bit and they're not made with modern alloy steels. And sometimes, you know, one particular workshop might make 10 blades and they might all flex slightly differently, not just because of the grind and the hollow grind and distal taper, but also sometimes because the heat treatment is slightly different between them. So we're on to the final two swords, both small swords. So the first one is an early example. It's almost a rapier type blade, but this is a really good example, in fact, for the purposes of this video, because it is essentially scaled down. It's nowhere near as long, it's nowhere near as broad. That's why it's called a small sword, because it's a rapier scaled down, essentially. And sometimes, for example, in Zach Wild's treatise, fencing treatise of 1711, he actually refers to small swords both as small swords and rapiers. For him, rapier, small sword is the same thing. This is just a small rapier. Right, so this blade is incredibly narrow. You'll notice it's got a fillet in the base of the blade, but then the blade from there upwards is essentially square. It's almost square. It's not quite square. I would say it is a slightly flattened square. Wouldn't quite call it flattened diamond. It does have edges, and I wouldn't want to get hit really hard with it. It would hurt, but I don't think it's going to really cut in the classic sense of the word. Okay, now this blade, relative to its size, is really quite stiff. Yes, it can flex, and as with the other swords, due to distal taper, it's probably about 8mm thick there, down to about 5mm, down to about 4mm, maybe 3.5, something like that. So it does have distal taper, but it never gets very thin. It keeps quite a lot of thickness up here, and it's got a square section. So much like the specialised rapier, cup-hilt rapier that we saw before, despite the fact this is an incredibly slender blade, this is actually harder to flex than the English rapier we saw right at the beginning. The English rapier has more metal in it, is a bigger blade, but this is actually a stiffer blade. Therefore, and it's also a smaller tip as well, okay, because it's got no real compromised cutting ability. So it tapers all the way down to a needle tip. So if this encounters clothes, even a thick winter coat or anything like that, even certain, like padded armour for example, this is a bit like a bodkin arrowhead, and it's got tiny amount of resistance going through the target. I mean, once that tip is through, the rest of the blade is going to follow through so easily. So not only has it got a tiny resistance to getting through, but you've got a relatively short blade of around 31, 32 inches, I think, on this. And it's fairly stiff as well. That means with the minimum of push, this is going to go through the target like a needle. And so finally we're up to the Kolishmad. Now I've done some videos talking about Kolishmads in the past, and funnily enough, one of the things I didn't mention is what we're now going to talk about, and that is cross-section and also a change in profile. So there are two things that make small swords such formidable thrusters, apart from the things I've already talked about, their shorter length, their thickness relative to their length, and so on. This is a classic example of a triangular blade. So you'll notice that it has a ridge in the middle there and a hollow there. So this is a hollow ground triangular blade. Think about it like that. So for minimum mass, you have maximum cross section. This is a hollow triangle, like a roof. It is therefore really, really stiff inherently because it is triangular, and also it's incredibly light. So what they've achieved with the triangular blades, and most small swords of the 18th and early 19th centuries have triangular hologram blades, not those edged blades like we've just seen there. Those are early examples. One is square, it's essentially a developed rapier blade, and the other one is similar, it's got some cutting capacity, and that is essentially, they're both essentially late rapier blades. This is what I would call the true small sword blade, the triangular blade, pioneered probably in France, and these blades are incredibly stiff and incredibly light, and also of course have a parallel with bayonet blades. Now bayonet blades are insanely stiff because they are also really, really short, but the small sword blade is not long. This is only about a 30-inch blade. Now, some people just fixate on reach, but also think about stiffness and penetrative ability. That first English rapier we looked at was quite flexible. So although you've got 40 inches of blade in front of your hand, much, much longer than this, if you hit thick clothing like a doublet, there's a chance the point won't go through and the blade will simply flex, which means you score a hit, but you don't do any damage to the opponent whatsoever. Whereas this blade, okay, you have to be closer, you have to get in closer to do it. But this, I can tell you, with that needle profile, the short blade and the hollow ground triangular cross section, has got so little flex in it. It's incredibly rigid. Now, finally, I mentioned the Kolishmad, the thing that I didn't mention before, and I didn't really think about before. This materially assists the stiffness, because remember we've talked about most of these blades are pretty stiff in the base of the blade and then only flex in the second half of the blade. With this blade, basically cannot flex at all ever in the base of the blade, because it is a large hollow ground triangle for the whole first, what, 10 inches, 9 inches of blade? So nothing in this blade is realistically ever going to flex. I mean, you'd bend, you'd snap the hilt off before you got this to flex. It's incredibly rigid, and it's therefore very unlikely that this part in front of it is going to, I mean, if I do that, I can very slightly flex it. So that means that the only flexible part of this blade is up here, and it's hollow ground triangle with a little needle point. So this is an incredibly back-weighted and nimble and quick weapon, but it's also incredibly powerful in the thrust. And it's no surprise that when they came to make lance tips in the 19th century, they essentially copied bayonet and small sword blades and made lance tips triangular and completely rigid. So there we go. I hope that's been interesting. I mean, can I flex this? Yes, I can, but this requires significant amount more force in my hand to flex it to that degree than the rapiers I showed before. So remember, not everything's about reach, penetrative power, and these small swords, I think a lot of people think of them as being sort of weak and feeble weapons and something that only dandies wore around for fashion reasons. BS! They are extremely dangerous and powerful killing machines for piercing through all sorts of targets very, very easily. And anyone who understands weapons, if you look at something like a Fairbairn-Sykes dagger, do you think less of the Fairbairn-Sykes dagger compared to, say, a Bowie knife because it's small and because it's very pointy and because it's quite light in the blade? No, because it's an incredibly well-designed and potent stabbing weapon, as is the small sword. So yes, you have a reach advantage. Yes, you can't cut with it, at least not the triangular bladed type. But when you do thrust something, it is going to go really far in, really, really easily, and come back out again easily again, and go in and in and in like a sewing machine. So thanks once again for watching, and thanks to Kenneth J, for sending through that email with a great question that springboarded me into making this video. I'm always happy to have other questions like this down in the comments, so if there are related questions or non-related questions, I'm always happy to read those, and sometimes it might lead to a video and you might get yourself mentioned here on the channel. So thanks a lot for that, and also thanks to the Patreons as well, because the patrons over there on Patreon actually give a lot of suggestions for things which end up as videos on this channel. So special thanks to the patrons, you mean the world to me, and I will see you back on the channel really, really soon. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you'll enjoy the next one. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.